ours, who is going to be introducing Rabbi Sabbath. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really my privilege to be here today. I've been sort of, I guess you could use the word, a fellow traveler with this conference. And it's sometimes actually literally over the last 4 years. And I'm particularly thrilled that we're focusing on gender issues this year, and I'm looking forward to a really exciting couple of days coming up. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Rabbi Dr. Rachel Sabbath Beit Halakmi. Rabbi Sabbath's talk will be informed by a career that has encompassed scholarship on Jewish theology and its implications for our times, service to a congregation as rabbi, and academic administration. Rabbi Sabbath currently serves the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati as the National Director of Recruitment and Admissions. There she is also a President's Scholar, and she heads the Office of Community Engagement. Founded in 1875, the Hebrew Union College is the largest and oldest Jewish seminary in North America and the longest operating Jewish seminary in the world. Prior to coming to the Hebrew Union College, Rabbi Sabbath served as vice president of the Shalom Hartman Institute. I believe that would have been in Israel? Yeah, in Israel. For over a decade, she was also a member of that institute's faculty, and she directed the Hartman Lay Leadership, Rabbinic Leadership, and Christian Leadership programs. She has served on the faculties of the faculty of the Wexner Foundation, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, and the Skirball Center. For more than a decade, Rabbi Sabbath also served as the rabbi of Congregation Shirat Hayam on Nantucket Island. She received her BA degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, her rabbinic ordination in an MA in Hebrew Letters at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, and her PhD in Jewish Philosophy and Thought at the Jewish Theological Seminary. She's an alumna of the Wexner Foundation and is a member of Phi Beta Kappa Society. For several years, Rabbi Sabbath wrote a monthly column in the Jerusalem Post, and she writes regularly for the Times of Israel, the Huffington Post, and other publications. She has co-authored 2 books, and she is co-editor of a forthcoming volume entitled Jewish Theology on Ethics and Gender. Her current project, I assume ongoing, is a book on the future of covenant for Jewish peoplehood. The wide range of her interests and expertise is further evident in a very selective sampling of her numerous journal articles. And I've just plucked a few that seem kind of relevant to the topic of this conference and I think kind of demonstrate the range of her work. One is called Radically Free and Radically Claimed: New Possibilities for Liberal Jewish Theology, which was published in Jewish Theology in Our Time. Another, The God Who Loves Pluralism, in a publication called More Than Managing. And finally, Loving God, Loving Torah, Loving Others, in Reform Jewish Quarterly. It's not surprising, then, that Rabbi Sabbath has been asked to speak throughout North America on the topics of leadership, Israel, gender, and theology, and we're really fortunate to have her here to speak to us tonight. The title of her talk is Gender and Judaism, the Ethics of Transformation, and please join me in welcoming Rabbi Dr. Rachel Sabbath Halakmi.
Thank you. I promise you I did not make up any part of my name. Although it is a challenge, it depends on where I am in the world, which part of that is a challenge and which religious community I'm in, which, part of my title is a challenge. There's some parts of the Jewish community that might not introduce me as rabbi. Rachel or Rachel, most people get. Sabbath, I really was raised Rachel Sabbath in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Beit Halakmi, we can all try that together. Beit Halakmi in Hebrew is the Bethlehemite. So I feel like I've come from Bethlehem to Nazareth. How appropriate. And it's my first time, so it's quite a pilgrimage. Really, no, that is the family name of my husband's family. We've been married for about 15 years, and they have a different religious tradition, which is that they descend from the house of King David. Of course, there's no evidence of that, but that is their attachment to those narratives, and of course the attachment to the land. He's a fifth-generation Israeli, my husband, who's also a liberal rabbi. So I'm so honored to participate in what I think is a really auspicious conference at an auspicious time. There could possibly be no more important issues facing the religious world community and human ethics in general than these topics and texts that we're going to discuss this evening and throughout the next few days. So I want to thank all of you at the Hickey Center and all of you who've been part of this conference and these conferences, and of course to this planning committee that inspired this conference. And I look forward to learning with all of you in so many ways. And so I'm really struck and feel the need to say the following Hebrew phrase, and we'll say it in English as well, which you might be familiar with, which is Hine ma tov u'ma na'im shevet achim gam yachad. How wonderful, Hine ma tov, it is for brothers and sisters to dwell together. And I will add, and even more powerful for us to come together to think and learn about sacred texts and our human realities. I will share with all of you some of my thinking and some of the ways that I think we might organize how we consider the question of gender in Jewish texts in particular, but I'm going to be sort of touching off on many ways on other religious traditions and what I think our challenge is here as a collective. I've been very inspired by your opening, both of you, by what we've heard this evening so far, to actually push us forward to what I hope will be an even grander mission. I want to begin actually by suggesting that if we take this opportunity very seriously, if we are lucky, if we are very lucky, we might achieve the level of a kind of interfaith dialogue that the late Bishop Krister Stendahl, who I assume I may not have to explain to many of you who he was. He was not only a bishop, but he was the dean of the Harvard Divinity School for many years. And he worked on this idea with the late Rabbi Professor David Hartman, who passed away a few years ago, of the Hartman Institute. And in their work together, Krister really taught, and he did ask me to call him Krister every time I referred to him as Bishop Stendahl. They worked on an idea called holy envy. What is holy envy? Holy envy is where we learn to understand and respect each other's traditions so deeply and so authentically that we even envy aspects of the other's tradition. If we truly reach this height of holy envy or sacred envy, then we are even more so out of love and commitment. Perhaps we are even inspired to seek to change or maybe even correct and improve our own traditions. So everything I will say this evening will be in that spirit of hoping to reach that level. But first, of course, a joke. Now, I'm hoping, I did check this joke with one of our hosts, but I want to just warn you, this is what they call that trigger warning. I want to warn you that some people find this to be a slightly rude, maybe even off-color, but it is an oft-told joke that I think bespeaks volumes of where we are in the Jewish community when it comes to gender. And of course, I myself might be possibly one of the offended parties, so I feel that in my role here this evening, I can tell this joke, and hopefully will let you know how in the Jewish community it's hard to say this is where we are when it comes to gender, because we also have, like all of you in your religious traditions, we have a very wide and broad spectrum of religious and ritual and sociological and, of course, political traditions in our various communities. I actually was at the table, and I was so enjoying hearing, because I often engage in the conflict between our religious movements and denominations, and, of course, the conflicts in Israel and between Israel and North America and amongst denominations in Israel. It's very political. And I was so relieved to overhear people speaking about conflicts in other faith communities. So that was such a pleasure. So here's the joke. I want to thank you for that. I already feel that it's been an important thing to come here this evening. And by the way, we can do that for each other as well, and maybe we can even learn from each other how to handle the diversity of opinions and the conflicts that may seem to us in the moment irresolvable, but in fact, perhaps some of you out there have dealt with some of these things, and I can learn from you. So the joke, of course. In an Orthodox Jewish wedding, Orthodox are those who follow the traditional Jewish law, the halakha, more stringently. At an Orthodox wedding, the mother of the bride might be pregnant. Okay, you following this? Okay. And it could be any of your weddings or the weddings that we all officiate at. At a conservative Jewish wedding, the bride might be pregnant, right? Because it's a more modern tradition, and there might have even been some cohabitation beforehand. At a Reform Jewish traditional wedding, which is primarily what the movement that I serve, the rabbi might be pregnant. And having been pregnant and the rabbi at many a wedding, I didn't always find that so funny. But now, of course, I function, by the way, in all of these communities in different ways. In a Reconstructionist wedding, which is considered to be a more liberal part of the Jewish community, both brides might be pregnant. So as you can see, right, it's all a matter of what community and world you live in and how you understand the sacred ritual of marriage, for that matter, and of course of religious leadership. But I want to push us forward. Don't worry, there will be extra credit for anyone who wants to identify the figure in this famous drawing. But I want to suggest that we actually begin at the beginning. Because in fact the question of women and gender in Judaism begins at the beginning of sacred texts that many of us share in common. Two core texts from the first book of books, the book of Genesis, expose for all of our generations and many of our traditions what I believe is a deep dialectic and deep ambivalence about gender from the very beginning, about gender and perhaps even what it means to be a human being. You probably know these texts well, and maybe some of us even know them in our sleep. But I just want to review them in order to make a particular point that we'll take with us in the moments and minutes ahead. The first text, of course, is from the book of Genesis, Bereshit, and it is a very, very powerful moment. I've taken the Hebrew here. How many are familiar with Hebrew at all? Okay, wonderful. So hopefully you can appreciate this. And it's a very powerful moment in the telling of the creation of the human being or human beings and what it means to be one. And this is not exactly the right text. Hang on a second. But I'm going to read to you actually from the verse right before it, but you'll see in a moment. The text right before it is, Vayomer Elohim na'aseh Adam b'tzelmenu, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, right? And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and all that creeps upon the earth. And God created, now I'm in verse 27, which is right before this one, and God created, Vayivra Elohim et Adam, God created the human being in God's own image, B'Tzalmo, B'Tselem Elohim bara oto, Zachar u'Nekeva bara otam. In the image of God, God created the human being, male and female, God created them. That's the verse that's just before this one, before giving them the first commandment, which is to be fruitful and multiply and to play a certain role in the world. But notice that in the first chapter of Genesis, how were male and female created? Obviously, this is hyper-binary in its ancientness. Zachar u'nikeva bara otam. Male and female, God created them. So what do we know about gender from the first chapter of the book of Genesis? Male and female created at the same time? Was it two sides of one person? Is it that within all of us there is male and female? Is it to remind us that in God's image, that deep within God are all genders? Is it to tell us that in fact female and male are absolutely equal, created at exactly the same moment as that first human being was, and reflect all that is godly in humanity? That's one set of possibilities. But, in fact, the more famous story is what comes in the next chapter, which is, in fact, from Genesis 2, which we have as, this is actually, apologies that this is not the right text, I'm going to bring us there in a moment, which we actually have as the idea that man was lonely, correct? Man was lonely, and how did woman get created? Man's hanging out in the Garden of Eden. Adam, the first man, gets to name all of the creatures. God doesn't actually, it's not man who says that God is lonely. God identifies that man is lonely and says to man, I will create for you a helpmate, an ezer kenegdo, which is to say that God becomes what I like to think of as the first great anesthesiologist and surgeon, and takes, as the story tells us, takes the rib from Eve, from Adam, and creates a woman from man, and lets Adam name her, right? That's the story. Raise your hand if you're more familiar with the second chapter than the first chapter. Right? That's the story of creation. But if you think about it, those stories, I'm afraid to talk about the editors of the Bible here, because that might be a different conference of interpretation. But it seems to me that there are multiple sensibilities, I'll say at least, about gender just in the first two chapters, in those first few verses, because either male and female were created at the same time, and they're essentially equally created in the image of God, or first there was man, and woman was created to be a helpmate. Right? Ezer kenegdo, which literally, by the way, in Hebrew means a helpmate opposite to a man. Right, literally even opposed to, which of course there are lots of jokes about, well, this is why, it's the woman's job to argue with the man. And it's the woman's job to keep a man in line. Or, as my husband likes to say when he thinks I'm giving him too much advice and direction, you're not supposed to be ezer kenegdo. You don't have to be, an argument with me. You're supposed to be ezer imadi, right? Help together with me, right, to work in partnership. But what we see deep in the biblical and rabbinic traditions in Judaism, and this is what I want to focus on, is there's actually a great tension. There's a great tension between that first story, total equality, total humanity, absolute equally images of God, and the second story of what I will say is clearly at least two different roles for male and female. I think that's the least we can agree on. Fair enough? Can we all agree on that? So it's fascinating if you think about even all of our religious traditions and what we represent. In effect, even the joke that I told you really indicates that the main things that even distinguish within our own faith communities, as I was learning more about even this evening, is that very often it is particularly this question of gender and power that is the point of differentiation between different narratives of Judaism. Bless you. And it's my contention that actually, at least our religious tradition, the only one that I believe I can at all speak for, there is an ongoing dialectic and ambivalence about this from the very beginning. Now, you might say, if you're a very modern person and you're really engaged in, I was just told that the documentary hypothesis is now passé. But were you to believe in multiple authors, you might consider that this is, just really a mess of the ultimate redaction of the Bible, because these two stories actually don't live well together. Or, if you wanted to be a bit postmodern about it, you might consider, and this is what I want to suggest, is that that's precisely what God intended. How's that for being post-feminist? In fact, God intends, dare I say, for us to live in this dialectic. That much of our religious traditions are about wrestling with our traditional texts and with the stories and narratives and the revelation that we and our ancestors have received that we're attempting to live out, and our own sense of absolute, ultimate equality and godliness of each person. And Adam and Eve, don't forget, at least in my understanding of it, they didn't have a religion. They probably became monotheists on the way out of the Garden of Eden. But they're not, it's not a Jewish, I'm not sure about that, by the way. They might seem to us, I like to see them sometimes as millennials, but that's another conversation. They're not Jewish, they're not Christian, they're not Muslim. They're human beings. So deep within the question of what it means to be a human being is this dialectical tension about gender. And of course, what we're learning in postmodernity is that gender's not binary at all. And that part of what we need to add to our reading of gender, of course, is this question of how then do we read these stories from a non-binary perspective. So up here is gracing us with her biblical presence. I mean, apparently she is whoever you want her to be. But this is a beautiful etching of Deborah, the prophetess of the Bible. I thought it was not, who guessed Deborah? You get extra credit. Yes, good. And I put it up here because it's quite dramatic. And it will also be an important image to have in our minds if we think about the transition of what the biblical view of women was versus the rabbinic view and the medieval view. The Bible actually has, as you all know, but I want to stress this from a Jewish perspective, actually women playing a whole variety of roles and actually helping to shift and change the tradition. They're playing the role of judge in the case of Deborah, playing a military role in other cases, in the case of Yael in particular. It's the daughters of Tzlofchad. How do you say that in English, somebody?
Some people say
Zelophehad, thank you, who in the Bible are the ones who insist that women should be able to inherit as well. So we actually have some pretty vocal and powerful women in the Bible. We also have ritual traditions which are only, they're separate and they're segregated when it comes to the priesthood and when it comes to ritual cleanliness. So the priesthood is entirely the priestly line, as many of you know, and women are servants of their husbands and live in their father's houses or their husbands' houses. But men and women were actually meant to observe the same kind of bodily ritual practices. Okay? Now, two of these things shift dramatically after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. which is to say that a whole new rabbinic culture, it seems to me that there was another culture developing at that time as well, another religious tradition. But actually the religious tradition that Jews today are living was just developing at that same time as well, and also defining itself over and against what Jesus was teaching. And Jesus was a great, from my perspective, a great learned rabbinic figure in many, many ways. But the rabbinic culture that's developing is a post-priestly cult, post-temple, diasporic religion, and it developed a whole set of laws about how to really take Judaism and Torah and make it utterly transportable and create the thing that now we're products of, which is we are survivors of many attempts at genocide and at expulsion and dispersion over the centuries, but actually that creation became so portable that actually, right, the Jew can live alone on a desert island. The Jew is ideally supposed to live in the land of Israel because there are many mitzvot, commandments that we can't do outside the land, but actually the Jewish community can thrive as long as it has a community, a basic set of at least 10 men and their families. And what else does it absolutely need? It needs actually 3 other things to survive. It needs a synagogue and a house of study. It needs to study. It lives in the text and interpretation. And it also needs a place for communal charity to be able to help those in need. And it also needs the ritual bath, the place where one goes to immerse oneself in cases of ritual impurity. So in a way, without the temple, right, many of these laws became very transportable and things that can be established in any community throughout the world and has been for these thousands of years. And yet, something very dramatic happened when we think particularly about the question of women. This case of Deborah actually becomes essentially not known until the modern era of a public leader with the authority to rule, is what I mean, okay? Because there are, of course, always exceptions to the rule. But in fact, what happens is that rabbinic literature focuses on the question of what the role is of what women should play. And so if you think about the different ways that we can define this, it's a way of seeing, hang on a second, it's a way of seeing that men and women should actually follow different roles. So in this case of whether who can marry a Kohen, hang on a second, that becomes a question of, this is just not the right text coming up here, hang on a second. This can be a question of whether or not one is pure, whether or not one has behaved a certain way, whether or not one is married in a certain way. But we have this question of how one is married that develops. If you see the second text from a tractate of the Talmud, how is a wife acquired? In 3 ways, right? And she acquires herself in 2 ways, meaning she can become divorced in 2 ways. She's acquired through money, there's an exchange of a marital document, and through sex. Through money, Beit Shammai says this means a certain amount, and another school of thought, Beit Hillel, says a pruta, or the equivalent of a pruta, right, a smaller amount of money. And then they argue about this for actually centuries. Later in later texts, you see that there's what becomes to us actually familial ancient view of women from the Shulchan Aruch, which is a legal text. A woman is not considered to be married except by way of betrothal, right, in which the betrothal was done appropriately. However, if he were to lie with her by way of harlotry without the name of betrothal, it is nothing, right, towards her status of being a married woman. Even if he lies with her with the intent of marriage, mutually agreed between him and her, she's not considered as his wife, and even if she dedicated herself only for him, rather the opposite is true, and he must be forced by the court to send her away from his home, right? So they're making sure there's no sex as being the way of marriage. For certainly she would be considered an embarrassment for immersion in a mikveh, and he will lie with her in ritual impurity in nida without her having been to the ritual bath. However, if she dedicates herself exclusively for him as his wife, and she immerses for him, there are those who would say that this is allowed, and she would be a pilegesh, as described in the Torah. There are those who say that this is forbidden, and they should both get whiplashes from the Torah as they have transgressed the precept, don't be a harlot. So what do you know from this text? I hope I've kept you awake, at least. I'm always worried about being the after-dinner speaker because, the blood sugar and everything. But I thought if I talked about sex enough, it would be helpful. So what do we know from this? There is disagreement. We know that one thinks it can be this way, one thinks it can be that way, but we also see that the woman isn't the agent. Right? In other rabbinic texts, the main thing that happens is that actually we see an ambivalence in a whole other area, the area of ritual. And in the area of ritual obligation, something very interesting happens. That we create two categories of ritual obligation in Judaism. One are all the mitzvot that are what you shall do, right? You shall give charity, you shall study, you shall pray. And then those are the positive commandments. And those can be divided up into ones that you have to do at a certain time, like prayer, let's say, and the ones that you just have to do in general, okay, like give charity, okay? So those are positive ones that you do either at a particular time or not. They're time-bound or they're not time-bound. Is everybody with me? Then there's another set of commandments, and you obviously all probably can think of parallels, which are what thou shalt not do, okay? And those are all, sometimes may be time-bound, but mostly they're not time-bound. So here's what happens to women. You would think that all commandments would be obligatory on. Okay, well, one might think in the modern era that commandments might be equally obligatory on male and female alike. Yes, no, maybe? One might think. But actually, in our separate roles, there are a set of commandments which are positive and time-bound that women are not obligated in. Okay? Like prayer, like putting on certain prayer garments, like doing things at certain periods of time. And women also, interestingly, one of the main things that happens in the rabbinic era, before I jump to the modern era, is that women weren't counted in order to fulfill a prayer quorum. So if you need 10 men to do something, to have evening prayer, morning prayer, afternoon prayer. We pray 3 times a day, according to Jewish law. You can only say certain major parts of the service and read from the ancient Torah scroll if you have 10 men above the age of bar mitzvah, above the age of 13. So you can have, let's say there's a table over there of 7 men and 3 women. Can you proceed? No. You can have 9 men and 20 women. Can you proceed? No. So one of the things that happened is there became a very significant bifurcation, I will say, in the rabbinic and medieval period of really men doing all of that public culture, interpretive prayer, public role, and women really being largely responsible for the internal, inside the house roles. And a lot of Jewish law developed around this idea that the kvod bat melech pnima, which means the honor of the daughter of the king, meaning the honor of a woman, because we're all sons and daughters of the king, and when we say that, we mean God, is within the house. Is within, I'm sure you can think of parallels in other traditions as well. So the woman was exempt from those time-bound positive commandments because it would actually take her outside the house at specific times, whereas actually we're meant to be inside the house taking care of all of those inside things. All of this might sound hopefully somewhat familiar, but also not terribly surprising in terms of rabbinic literature. But what happens is when you see the exceptions to the rule, that's when you know what? What do you know when you feel the exceptions to the rule? Maybe there's not really a perfect categorizing going on here. Maybe it's not only about categorizing. Maybe, in fact, there's something much more complicated going on here. So there are actually a few exceptions to the rule. I'll just give you one example. One example is that lighting the Hanukkah candles, which you might be familiar with, is in fact, it's time-bound, because you're supposed to do it at a certain time, as close to sunset, the 8 nights of Hanukkah. So that's time-bound. It's positive. It's what you must do. And actually, women are obligated in that. Why? Good, because it's in the home. It's also in the synagogue, but it's actually not true of other candle lighting that happens in the home. Why? It's fascinating. Good. Who said that? No, it's hysterical. Like, you could not make this up, because they too were present at the miracle of Hanukkah. Now, you just want to say that makes absolutely no sense. There's nothing like very clear about that, because, I mean, where were we the rest of the time? Right? Suddenly we're present and you can't go ahead without us, but the rest of the time, revelation, prayer, study, law, they don't need us. But suddenly at Hanukkah, and there's a couple of other exceptions like that. And what do you know when the exception doesn't make sense? Our teacher, David Hartman, made this very, very clear when I first learned these texts with him about 20 years ago, which was that, in fact, can't you smell it? Can't you hear it? That ambivalence, right, is sort of percolating up. There's this constant tension and internal critique. They create clear categories, and then there's the battle over it. There's the tension over it. There's the exception to the rule, and there are many of them. And then as time develops, and we'll move quickly to this next stage, as time develops, we actually have a very different sense of what is happening. And what we have here is a set of different ways of understanding, I would say, gender altogether, right? You have, and we can move to a postmodern understanding of it as well. But I would say we have a sense that actually most of what's happening in rabbinic literature is to try to set up a community that will be able to sustain itself, that will be able, in fact, to perpetuate those sacred texts and those things that are most important to us. But in effect, there's a constant tension about this question of gender. So if you think about it, one of the greatest gifts of the 20th century, I would say, if I can jump to the modern period and what we're all living and struggling with, is the idea that we have been able to think about the other, woman or people of other traditions, in new ways. But I would say it continues to be an increasingly and incredibly challenging human project. In fact, you could even say that this question of the role of women in religious traditions is the unfinished religious business of the 20th century. And here we are in the 21st century, and it's not only far from finished, it actually remains enormously challenging. So before we move to these two models of understanding gender, I want to speak about my own community, because hopefully that will help us consider where we are at this stage. So in my own community, I would say that there's really three major phases that we can speak about. One of them is really is really about this move between the essentialist model and a constructivist model. But the first stage in the liberal Jewish world, the first stage we would really call it maybe second wave, maybe the period of post-emancipation full egalitarian status. And that really is a question largely of sociology. Can women and men sit together in the synagogue? Can women become rabbis? So for those of you who think I'm one of a very few women rabbis, there are actually more than 500 women rabbis today. The large majority of them have been ordained from the Reform movement, who started ordaining in 1972. In 1972, but the debate started in about 1872, at least, or you could say the debate started with Deborah the prophetess, right? What role really should women play? So in that case, that debate was really largely answered by the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and in fact, there were lots and lots of battles about those things, and our denominations emerged out of those debates. The second, and that's probably very familiar to you, but that's really about, full equality by shifts in legal status. And the other main thing that happened in that first period was that was the difference that happened around marriage. That rather than women being bound to their husbands and not being able to get a divorce unless the husband granted it, just to forgive me for the oversimplification, for those of you who know the complexity of it. Really, it was the progressive part of the religion and the Reform movement that said, no, it's going to be fully egalitarian. If there's a civil move toward a divorce, there's a divorce, and that we will create the religious context. But this is actually where our communities continue to be in a huge amount of conflict, because the Orthodox community, and particularly in Israel, still holds by this notion that the man has to give the divorce document in order to set the woman free, really. And if a man doesn't want to do that, he can carry on with his life, but she cannot go and marry somebody else and have children with that person, because she still is anchored, quite literally is the term, to that first husband. And so she actually can't do those things without creating enormous status problems for her and her children. So there are a number of women throughout the world who are actually considered anchored. And one of the major ethical issues in the Jewish community today is what kind of pressure can be brought to bear in the Orthodox community to encourage those men not to use a woman's freedom as part of a divorce battle. There's a lot more we could say about it, but it's that kind of legal status that has really changed for all of the non-Orthodox denominations, beginning actually in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century. The second wave of the liberal denomination, and soon we'll open to some questions and conversation, is what I would call the expanding liturgical and theological possibilities. It's really in the 1960s, late 60s till today, that there's been an enormous amount of first experimentation, but then gradual significant changes in our liturgy. Anybody here dealing with liturgical change? It's something we can all relate to, and I think we wouldn't be in this room if we didn't feel also the enormous tension and responsibility about that. But in fact, it was in the Reconstructionist denomination originally where there were significant changes. Most of them in all of our liberal denominations today, and by that I mean conservative reform, Reconstructionist, and renewal, and lots of non-denominational folks, they really revolve around this question of gender. When we name our male ancestors, should we name our female ancestors as well, in one of the main three prayers that we say every day? How much do we continue to include the liturgy about wanting to return and build a third temple? Lots of tension around that in the news even today about what our connection and role is with that sacred space. And also this question about how we see the other, how we see the non-Jew. So there have been, since the Middle Ages, actually lots of changes where some prayer books, really I think out of a sense of I don't have to be too careful here, right? I was told I can just be really blunt. A lot of times there have been prayers that have been against the non-Jew out of a sense of we've almost been annihilated, pogroms, the Cossacks, horrible things have happened to us. We have no power until 1948, zero power, zero sovereignty, zero capacity for self-defense, oftentimes no rights or capacity to own land or anything else. So what do we have to fight back and to give ourselves strength? Any of us in our religious traditions about the other. It has been some words that are not so nice about the other, and the other's God, or what the other has or hasn't done to protect us, which can all be summed up by what Elie Wiesel's Night, you know that book? I hope you do. Does anybody know what it originally was called before his publisher worked with him? While the World Stood By. So I think there's this deep sense in the Jewish psyche, and by this I'm intentionally being very personal and vulnerable. I think there is a deep sense in the Jewish psyche of vulnerability and a deep also desire to be loved and not to be pursued and hated. And destroyed over the generations. And so there have been times, less proud times in our liturgy where we've expressed that. But in modern liturgy, really since the early 20th century, all of that has been removed because we wanted to be fully American. We wanted to be fully returned to our what I will call our universalist roots as human beings. And so our prayer books today are filled with a lot of universal and accepting love. In fact, sometimes those people might critique some of our liberal prayer books and say, they sound awfully much like the Universalists. Some people mean that as a compliment, of course. And there's a lot to be said for that, because I will return to this point that we actually do share so much more in common, I would say, as religious people than what divides us. So most of the changes that have been made in the liturgy have been about those questions per se. But lastly, I'll conclude with a statement by our teacher, Rabbi Dr. Rachel Adler, who says that although we have inherited modernity's egalitarianism, its faith in the human power to remake society and lavish benefits on all its members, right, that's modernity, perhaps its optimism, its belief in a harmonious and balanced universe are no longer theologically convincing. There is something so optimistic about modernity that proved not to be true. Right, if you think about how much the liberal movements embraced modernity, one of my teachers, Eugene Borowitz of blessed memory, calls it, modernity became for us a false messiah. Because, right, the country and the culture that had most embraced the ideas of emancipation and the modern era of science and human progress and music and philosophy, and where we were professors in the universities and creating our own institutions, where did we find ourselves? On the trains to Auschwitz. And where did America and the world find ourselves? We found ourselves with Hiroshima and other such contexts. And so you'll see that this question is really about women and gender is really the unfinished business that we all need to attend to. The complex task that remains is the full harnessing of the richness and multivocality of the Jewish tradition, combined with the knowledge of what a completely different approach and experience of it might teach, in order to create new ways of studying text and living Jewish and traditionally religious lives for both men and women and those who define themselves in a variety of new ways for us to understand and incorporate. Such a new approach, if carefully and responsibly developed, will surely contribute to the development of Jewish religious and cultural life as a whole, and thus ensure that one of modernity's greatest promises, equality for women, will be met with the evolving wisdom and creativity of the Jewish people and all those who learn and study with us. I want to conclude with a bit of a prayer. Shortly, in the next couple of days, we're commemorating in the Jewish calendar the destruction of the Second Temple, which we refer to by its date, the 9th of Av. And the 9th of Av, if you think about it, there have been lots of destructions in our tradition. In fact, we even tell a good joke about it, which is, they tried to destroy us, we survived, let's eat. Couldn't you all tell similar stories? But in fact, we have this deep connection to these stories of destruction, but what we also have, and they came at the hands of the Romans or the Syrians or these or that other people, and they were horrific, and thousands and millions of people lost their lives, and we were dispersed, and now we've returned to our homeland with the human right of self-defense and nationhood. But actually, in a Talmudic text from probably about from the 5th century, there's a text that teaches us, that asks, why was the temple destroyed? Why was your sacred place destroyed? And one of the reasons that's given is not because of the Romans and them, or bad politics, or bad relationships, but actually because of what the rabbis say was something wrong within the community itself, what they call sinat chinam, or baseless hatred. Meaning, we are all responsible for our worlds and what happens to them. So what I want to suggest to all of us this evening, and with this I really will close, is that perhaps that is precisely what's happening in our world today. That what is destroying our world and many nations is senseless and baseless hatred between us and amongst us. And what the Talmud teaches us in this ancient text is that in order to prevent future destructions and in order to rebuild our sacred spaces and our sacred human culture, we need to find greater and deeper and more powerful ways of overcoming that baseless hatred and engaging in what we might call baseless love. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Sabbath. She has agreed to take some questions, and we'll take our orders from Dr. Shafiq as to how much time we have here.
Who else can give us orders? Commandments. Questions, comments, arguments.
I just wanted to know your thoughts about
Hello? Okay. Yeah, I just wanted...
We just say your name and...
Yeah, my name is Tabassum Javed, and I'm a congregant of the Islamic Center of Rochester here, and participating here today. My question is about the Wailing Wall issue of the women being able to pray there. What's the update on that, or what are your thoughts about it, and has that been resolved to some degree? And because it is very much in line with
yes.
what we're talking today.
I have a PowerPoint about that too, if you'd like. I do. No, seriously, it's a fascinating issue. Does everybody know what he's mentioning? Because it's in the papers. Don't you love it when your intra-Jewish political, religious debates are like all over the papers? It's great. So I actually myself have been quite involved in that, and it is, of course, one of the examples of, it's a great case study, in fact, for where we are on all these issues. Women of the Wall, so there's the Kotel, which is the Wailing Wall, which is the remaining part of the temple that we're commemorating its destruction from 70 CE. This is a later supporting wall that was built, and traditionally Jews, when we always pray in that direction from wherever we are in the world. So it's often east from this part of the world. It is east from this part of the world, and the desire in terms of if we have a sacred space, a most sacred space, it is that space. It is that space. So for centuries, we have turned and prayed in that direction, and we have desired and sought to be there. In fact, the Ethiopian Jews, and others throughout history risk their lives, and in their mind is being able to get to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem to get to that space. So the debate of late has been whether or not, for the last 27 or 8 years, almost 28 years, has been, first, there were no religious divisions. I'm trying to do this in a very short way for those who may not understand all of it. Raise your hand if you know about Women of the Wall. Okay. So at this Wailing Wall, you can have now today, for a number of years, really since the establishment of the state, the Orthodox part of the Israeli government. The Israeli government there's not a separation of church and state. I suppose I should begin there. Like in many of the countries that we're connected to, there's not a separation of church and state. In fact, you have almost what, on a good day, I like to call parallel play. You have civil courts and you have religious courts, and we have them in many countries in the world, actually. And what we know is that the Orthodox rabbinate was primarily given control of that, and it meant that that women could not organize as a minyan, right, because they're not a prayer quorum. So we couldn't be a minyan, and we couldn't wear prayer shawls, which most of us wear in prayer today. And in fact, we were arrested for doing so in 2012-13, prevented from bringing Torah scrolls there, lots of violence. In fact, at the beginning of the new month, which, if today's the 7th of, so last week, the goal has been over the last 28 years is a group of women called Women of the Wall have been gathering there and have been asking to be able to pray there. And so in their desire to do that have been all of these debates. Over the last couple of years, there have been, and I've been very involved in it, I've actually been a critic of it as well. I was very critical of it because I felt that there were just so many more ethically pressing issues for Israel and for the Jewish people to face. And that for Israelis and for Jews of the diaspora, but particularly for Israelis and myself an Israeli, I really felt that this should not be the issue. And what one of my colleagues argued about in public with me often was they would say, what can I do, Rachel? The Jews of the world, this is the issue. This is the place. Having equal access to this place, this is the issue that pulls at their minds and their heartstrings for generations. And I would be like, well, what about the 1.5 million, Palestinians under Israeli control? Or what about the impoverished group, that? What about the migrant workers? What about the asylum seekers? What about the immigrants? What about the Syrian children who need medical attention? We actually do have several hospitals. Israel has several hospitals set up, I don't know if you know this, that are taking care of enormous numbers of Syrian children. So, but for the Jewish people, this place has really been the debate, has been the main, one of the main issues. And so, what's happened is an agreement was reached a couple of years ago in which there was supposed to be the creation of a third section, because when in doubt, if there are two sections, build a third. So there has been this third in an archaeological garden, and we have access to it, but no, we want to be in the main place, right? Because if we don't have equal access to the main sacred space, is there truly equality? If we don't have the right to pray with prayer shawls and read from the Torah and pray out loud once a month for about an hour and a half, is that really full equality? Now, just so you know, lots of Israelis, including my husband, completely think this is utterly ridiculous, mostly because they think the Western Wall is a sacred space, right? Is no longer the full Jewish story. That's anywhere in the world God is present, and that really this is a pile of ancient stones. Other Israelis often feel that, American Jews are once again meddling in that business, and we should get out of the story because it's their land. That part of Jerusalem was conquered by the Israelis, taken from the Jordanians in the 67 Six-Day War, and it has been complicated ever since, right? Because it's this question, but I think it's a great teaching question because it really brings to bear all of those main issues, right? What is the role of women in the public sphere? Are other forms of Judaism legitimate? And the third is, of course, does the diaspora Jewish community matter to the Israeli government and to the Israeli community? So you have every great big issue playing itself out about 70 meters. And we don't even agree with each other about it. So there's no resolution, but it is primarily, I would say, it's not just a realistic thing of access and equality, but it is highly symbolic, right? And add to that, of course, the Temple Mount and all the security issues, which I am definitely not going to go into this evening. It's a powder keg in every way.
Thank you.
I think it's, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I learned a lot. I'm Ute Hüsken from Heidelberg University. I'm working on Indian religions. And I found it very fascinating how you showed the ambivalence in the early text about gender and about the gender divide or not, which we find also in early Buddhist texts. And I think, at least that's would be my argument, is it's exactly this ambivalence that also makes tradition survive and be flexible, so to lean towards different directions and different times. But you were also making this point about the tradition becoming portable. And I find that very fascinating, but I did not really get how you connected it to the assignment of different roles to gender. So I would like you to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, wonderful question and connection. First of all, the Dalai Lama actually has turned to rabbis, actually of a variety of different Jewish religious denominations, precisely about this question of diaspora survivalism. Right? How is it that we have continued to have such a deep and strong and intense identity throughout the world? And I think it is connected. This is largely sociological. Anything critical I'm saying, I hope you hear my love of all of it at the same time that I'm critical. I think part of its survival depended on, in many ages, that clear role distinction. And so it developed, and don't forget, because we've lived everywhere, and we live everywhere still, and Israelis travel everywhere, you really can't escape us. It means that we have also we've primarily adapted to the cultures in which we've lived. With great food. We, of course, always start to look like the people amongst whom we've lived, whether it be Africa or India or Iraq or wherever. Great food, thankfully, languages, everything about a culture of that place. But I would say often that ambivalence becomes more a mirroring of the cultures in which we've lived. So if we're living in medieval Spain, our communities also in functioning around gender tend to look like that, right? And the same thing in in India or in China or anywhere else. So we're very much, the chameleon in us can adapt to that. And I would say it's also a deep part of survival. The first thing that you want to do, and a big chunk of our community is very much engaged in this in a very powerful way, the first thing you do when you've been nearly annihilated and you've experienced repeated actually, but a modern attempted genocide is, what do? What becomes your primary way of serving God? To repopulate. right? And so the huge emphasis on reproduction necessitated, I believe, also this increase, and it still does in the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel today, this focus on that gender distinction. I do think one of the critiques of modernity is that the more and more we, modern women go out there and become religious leaders and get PhDs, are we having fewer children? Right, is our embrace of modernity at the expense of our actual survival, not to mention intermarriage and assimilation. So I think these questions are very much interrelated. And today, it's hard to see our own life, our own historical period, right, in a zoom out. But I think that's one of the big dilemmas of this period in time, is how to make sure that we continue to preserve our rich culture and tradition and family and population, and at the same time live this incredibly golden, powerful age of Jews that live primarily in two centers, in North America and in Israel. All these questions are so great. Obviously we could have more and more sessions about any of them, but yes, please.
Carol Tometsko. I was completely appreciative of the comments that you made about Rabbi Rachel Adler, and specifically what you said about constructionists. Aren't we just going wacko in this country over this whole thing of transgenders? And when did she pull that together?
In the past couple of years, last 5 years.
I really, really appreciated that. Thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Yes, and it's also a big, not a big issue, but it's an issue in the Jewish community that we're also working to embrace. Sorry.
Looking for you. You suddenly disappeared.
Wait, tell me who you are.
I'm Sayyid Zakiya Hasna Islam. I use my middle name. The first name is family. I'm from I'm sorry. Oh, I'm all never good at that. Okay, you have to forgive me. Actually, I've raised my hand to make a comment because I got stuck at the very beginning when you quoted the bishop saying about the holy envy. Uh-huh. That is so beautiful. My journey partner was this Orthodox Jewish lady, and
this precious one.
Then the one sitting next to me, and we were talking about. I was quoting one of my very favorite ayats, verses from the Quran, which says that God, in the Quran, God is speaking directly to the reader, saying, "If I had wanted to," and boy, I would be misquoting, so forgive me, those who know. But basically, the gist of is that if I wanted to, I could have made you all the same, but I didn't, because I wanted you to compete in good works, and to know. Sorry, the first thing is to know. That means to learn when we expand it, and then to compete in good works. And that is exactly, to me, is that what you meant with that holy envy? Because that is the most beautiful thing, to learn through the differences, through the tensions, through the dialectics. And this is where I'm very much into the mysticism. This is where I feel the mystics fill in the gaps to show that tensions are just beautiful. And so that was really a comment, but you just captured me with that comment. And I was, I don't know whether I understood it wrong or right or wrong, the question that came from Uta. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing her name correctly or not. But her question seemed to be leading to transportable, and the way I saw how you describe it is because it became transportable and it became very adaptable to the modern question of the role of women, which is really quite recent, even in the Western world, no matter how much they try to say, oh, no, it's very recent. So that's how it is transported transportable because it's expanding, and we are all dealing with it with the same energy now, and becoming a combined force from all other traditions. So it's basically a comment.
No, it's
thank
wonderful.
you.
You've said, you've emphasized that it's not just transportable over space, but it's transportable over time.
Over time.
But I want to clarify something
culture.
about, and cultures.
Yes.
I want to clarify something about Bishop Stendhal. The important religious piece of what he's saying is, comes in that same essay, which I didn't say before, and I want to be sure we think about it during this conference, is that none of us have a monopoly on God. We know and believe our own religious truths, but we alone don't have all of them. Right? That I need you in order to understand God better, and you need me in order to understand God better. So if none of us have a monopoly, then we absolutely need each other in order to know more God.
That's what I tell my students in the religion of the world, and they bring that famous story of the 3 blind men and the elephant, and I say if the elephant holds the rope and thinks, oh, it's just like, the tail, and says just like a rope, he's not going anywhere. But he keeps following the rope and kind of goes to the rest of the body. All he'll realize is, oh, it's so much more than what I am holding. And same thing with the other blind man who is holding the leg. If he keeps holding the leg, he's just going to stay blind. But if he keeps following it and going, and oh my God, this way more than, yeah, that's what it is.
So that's the broad religious zoom out, but in the zoom in, and I'll conclude with this. I could go on until tomorrow morning, but I think we should rest and prepare for tomorrow. So we can give this beautiful, it's all works out in the end, framework to it, and together we'll know God. But in the actual moment, in the contention about space and who has authority over such places, right? These are all very real issues, and they're very gendered. So I just want to point, this is just an image to help us see, really back to your question, sir, and for all of us in terms of what's being played out now. On the left side is a very famous, almost iconic photograph from 1967, the end of the Six-Day War in Israel, right? Israel had been attacked by all of its Arab neighbors. They were digging mass graves in Tel Aviv because everybody thought this was the end of that young Jewish state. This was the end. There was no way that Israel could survive it. And in a very miraculous way, the forces that had attacked Israel were pushed back, and Israel was able to gain some territories which are continued to be disputed, but it was able for the first time, the Jewish state had Jewish access to that sacred space for the first time at the moment of this photograph in 1967. So these are paratroopers. They're all alive today. They're older men, and that is them liberating that sacred space. It is a very powerful image. And in 2012, that same famous photographer took a picture of the leaders of Women of the Wall, whose claim it is that they are liberating that sacred space now for all Jews to be able to have full access to it. And these paratroopers have stood politically by the Women of the Wall and saying that we did not liberate that space just for one denomination to have access to it. Actually, it's a sacred space that should be accessible to all, of all faiths and of all genders. And I hope that these are some of the issues that we can work through in the days to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Sabbath, for beginning this conference so well. Just a wonderful, wonderful beginning for the conversations. Oh, yes, I could do that too. And thanks to all of you for being here this evening. And we hope to see you all bright and early tomorrow morning. I know it's going to be a really rich series of conversations. Okay. So thank you all for being here tonight, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow morning when this great conversation will continue, and I know it's going to be a great day and a half or so together.
Thank you very much. And just a little bit more, those of you who came late, for those who are in the Porca or staying in the dormitory here, the breakfast is here at 7:30 to 8:30. All of you, we will be, the rest of the program, all panels are at the Galesano Academic Center. I think you have the room number, so the signs are there. Many of you are new to this campus, so the signs are there. Follow the signs. It's on the ground floor, and our team will be there all to welcome you and to show you which room. You have to pick up the panel, which one where you are going. All of you are welcome. Since you have now the tag, you are welcome to attend any of the session you would like to attend. So don't hesitate to be here on time. So the first session will begin at 9 sharp up to 10:30, and then there is 15 minutes break, or 30 minutes break, by the way, and the next one begins at 11 o'clock to 12:30, and from there we will come all here for lunch and our keynote speaker. So that's the way we do, and then we'll go back to the Galesano Center, and we'll have the other sessions coming back here at 5:30 finally for dinner and our next keynote speaker, and the same we will continue on Tuesday also. We thank you all. Thank you very much, and especially many of you have come from a faraway distance. Must be very tired. Take some good rest. Anything you need, the help is there for you.